Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from RAU'S. Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC Civil Services Examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 28th of January 2021. The articles which we are going to cover today are displayed on the screen. Let us now begin the discussion. So the first announcement is that UPSC Prelims 2020 analysis of History GS Paper 1 has gone live today morning, and this awesome analysis has been done by Mangal sir. It is advised that you go through this particular discussion to understand the philosophy behind UPSC Prelims examination for History section. Then the mains question assignment, a question for mains examination which goes live every Thursday, has been uploaded on the website and link for the same is given in the description of the video. What are some of the environment friendly ways of fly ash utilization? What are the recent norms set by Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change in this regard? This is a 15 marker question and needs to be answered in 250 words. All those people who submit their answers by Saturday will get evaluation done from the faculties at RAU'S. Let us now begin the discussion. Let us now begin a discussion on a very important topic from the perspective of both prelims as well as mains examination, and that is the publication of draft Science, Technology and Innovation Policy which was released on 1st of January. And as we know, government comes up with a policy, and following that release of policy or a scheme, its analysis gets published in newspaper. And so, in this particular article, author Mr. C.P. Rajendran states that the draft science policy is a rambling document. Rambling means very lengthy, but it contains nuggets of scientific vision and information. So overall, to sum it up, according to him, this policy is in the right direction. But we are not going to keep ourselves limited to what he has said. We are going to first understand the current state of affairs as far as science, technology and innovation is concerned in India, because once we understand the current context, we will be able to appreciate the vision of the policy. Once we have appreciated the vision of the policy, then we will look at the important features of this particular draft policy, and then finally we will look into some of the issues which still have not been resolved or addressed in this particular draft policy as well. So what is wrong with India's science, tech and innovation? Now when I say what is wrong with it, there must be something wrong, only then government has come up with a policy, because if something is right, there is no need for the government to intervene in that particular area. And so there are a lot of ways through which India's state of affairs in science and technology can be estimated. And these are number of researchers involved, number of researchers per million population involved in science and tech, spending on R&D, number of publications per year dealing with innovation, and then finally, how many people cite the documents being published by Indians. So all these criteria are very important indicators of the state of affairs of science and technology for any country. And so let us see how India performs as far as number of researchers currently active in science and tech. So if you look at the number of researchers in India, it is around 1/5 of that of China, 1/20th of that of USA, and only 3%, that is around 1/30th of that of South Korea. Okay, let's take another parameter, which is number of researchers per million population. So every 10 lakh people in India, we have 216 number of people who are actively involved in research. But if you see, South Korea has 7,100. That is around 35 times more than that of India. Similarly, US has around 4,300 per million population, and China has 1,200 researchers per million population, but that is around 6 times higher than that of India. If we talk about spending on R&D, which is going into science and tech, it is less than 1% of the GDP in India currently. But if you look, South Korea leads the game over here as well, with 4.3% of overall GDP being spent on R&D. Now here an interesting fact is that in 1996 and 1997, both China as well as India spent around the same amount of percentage of GDP on science and tech. And in last 20-25 years, India has reached from 0.6 to 1%, whereas China has tripled the investment. So they started out at the same location, but China has emerged as a clear winner so far. Then if we talk about number of publications per year from a particular country, India publishes around one third of the total number of publications from China. But that is not important. What is important is that how many people refer to your work, include your work in their own researches. Because even if the number of publication is low, but if its citation is high, then that means it is a very high value research. And India performs very poorly as far as citation per document is concerned. And one of the most important reasons behind such a poor performance is plagiarism, which destroys the credibility of the institutions in India. But anyways, we'll not go into that. So these facts were mainly in order to make you understand that there is a need for a clear-cut intervention and push from the government side. Apart from that, these figures written in blue colors are important facts which will help you in mains as well as in essay examination. So please memorize them. So once we have established the current state of affairs, of course, we can now appreciate what the vision of the policy is. As far as the deficit in the number of researchers is concerned, it will aim to double the number of full-time equivalent researchers as well as expenditure in research and development every 5 years. Then it talks about placing or positioning India among the top 3 scientific superpowers within 10 years and to become technologically self-reliant country. Then it aims to attract and retain critical human capital through people-centric STI policy. And then finally, it aims to build individual and institutional excellence in STI with the aim of reaching the highest levels of global recognition as well as awards in next 10 years. So this is a vision. And vision is achieved through features or the provisions in the policy. And let us see that. And so let us now begin the discussion on the features. And one of the important features of this policy, and that is why it has been written at number 1 position, is that it aims to create open science framework and inclusiveness. Now here, open science is a very particular term. Open science or open research means that conduct of a research in such a way so that the research can be disseminated to the very wide audience. So for example, there are 2 ways to do a research. Conduct your research in your lab, keep it totally secret from others, and then publish it or get it patented. But other way to do research is to collaborate other people working in the similar field, involve students in your work, and once that work is published, make it available for free for the wider audience or the public. Now it has a lot of advantages. It gives more exposure to the work of the scientist. People who work in a similar field can apply the findings. Citation rates will be higher if you allow others to use your work. Then finally, it has chances to be included in the policy making. The work of the researchers will reach wider audiences. Taxpayers get value for money, and researchers in developing countries can see most of the works. So this is one. Second is one nation, one subscription policy. So it envisions free access to all journals, Indian and foreign, doesn't matter, for every Indian against a centrally negotiated payment mechanism. So what happens, and most of the people who have done BSc or MSc must have gone through this pain of accessing these journals from Indian universities, and what they find more often than not is that access is denied because their university has not paid for the access to that journal. And so most of the Indians are devoid of this immense knowledge of this premium research going on in USA, Europe, and various places across the world. And so what this policy envisions is that the central government, on behalf of 1.5 billion people, will negotiate a deal with 2 or 3 publishers which publish almost 95% of the work, that any Indian, if she wants to access research paper, that should be available to him or her free of cost, and here is the total lump sum amount. And that is going to be a watershed moment in India's science and tech research, because even a student from class 8th, if he or she has intrigued mind, can go visit the website of the journal and download the PDF for free, which is impossible right now. Then it quite clearly talks about gender parity in science. Now, when we talk about gender, we just don't talk about women. We also talk about LGBTQ community, and that is also reflected in the policy. And to address the issue of inclusion and equity in India's science research and technology innovation, it has made 4 very powerful recommendations. One of them is mandatory positions be allocated for the excluded sections in academics. It talks about 30% reservation for women in decision making, for example, the body which decides the awards in science and various others. Then it talks about shifting from the concept of biological age to that of academic age. So you must have known that whenever we apply for a position, there is usually a cutoff age. But the problem with women is that they have to go through the biological cycle of childbearing, most of them. And what childbearing does is that it interrupts the pursuit of professional career. In most cases, it inflicts a full stop, but in some cases, it is a comma. But nonetheless, there is an interruption in the life cycle of a woman due to childbearing. And so what happens is that when they have to resume their career, they have already crossed that age limit. And so that is why the participation of women, especially in high science and research, is very, very low. And so that is why it talks about changing the criteria from biological age to that of academic age for women. So number of years you have experience in research, the number of papers you have published should be the determining criteria, and not whether you are above 35 or 40 years of age or whatever may be the cutoff date. Then it talks about dual recruitment policy for couples. So basically what it means is that if there is a couple and if both of them are competent enough, they both should be hired at the same place. Otherwise what happens is that a female partner, especially in Indian society, has to change places according to the employment position of the male partner. Then it envisages a very, very important entity for collaboration and ensuring ease of doing research, that is the proposed Science Technology Innovation Observatory, or STIO. Now, according to the policy, the NSTIO will act as a central repository for all kinds of data related to and generated from the science, technology and innovation ecosystem, and it shall be accessible to many other people, enabling the ease of doing research. Then it also talks about various kinds of funding related to research and development. First and foremost, it wants to expand the funding of science, technology and innovation ecosystem in our country. It wants to incentivize private participation. It wants to increase the participation of the private sector in research and development. And for that, it talks about various kinds of incentives for leveraging the private sector's R&D participation. To create avenues for collaborative funding through a portfolio-based funding mechanism, it talks about ADMIRE program, or Advanced Missions in Innovative Research Ecosystem, or ADMIRE. And then finally, in science, technology and innovation, it talks about two agencies, Financial Authority and Development Bank, which according to the policy needs to be set up to direct long-term investments in select strategic areas. So these are the features, but there must be some issues. Now here I would like to point out that since this is a draft policy and so it is liable to change over the course of time, and so the issues which we are going to discuss right now might not remain relevant because the government might decide to incorporate these changes. So the first and foremost issue is how these targets shall be achieved. We have understood that it wants to increase the funding, it wants to incentivize participation of private sector in R&D, it wants to leverage the participation of private sector, it wants to increase the gender participation. All these targets are quite similar to the Science and Technology Policy 2013, which was brought just 7 to 8 years ago, and its performance has been dismal. And so people are commenting what is unique about this particular policy which will lead to its success. And there does not seem to be any innovative idea which has been incorporated in this particular policy. Then the draft policy visualizes decentralized institutional mechanism, which is basically bottoms up approach. But if you read the fine print of this particular policy, it will be clear that ultimately it is a top-down approach, because eventually it talks about creation of authorities, executives, giving them powers. So all of them is nothing but a top-down approach. And so if you really want to decentralize science research, we need to explore granting of more autonomy to research and academic centers, which has not been stated in this particular policy. So these are just two issues as of now, as in when they emerge, and finally when the draft is converted into the policy, we will take up more issues with this particular one. So with respect to science and technology sector, it is important to keep these facts in mind because they clearly indicate the place of India in global scenario, the vision of draft policy, the features of the draft policy, and the issues of the draft policy. Owaisi Viswam filed dissent on DNA bill. So Mr. Owaisi, along with a CPI leader, have filed dissent notes to the Parliamentary Standing Committee's report on the DNA Technology Use and Application Regulation Bill 2019 on the grounds that it does not take into account their concerns over privacy violations. So DNA Technology Regulation Bill is one of the most contested bill in last 2 to 3 years, if not the most contested bill. And so in this regard, it is important for us to first understand what is the need for DNA technology regulation, what are the highlighting features of this particular bill, what are the issues and challenges in the bill, and then finally how we can resolve those issues. So just like always, we will begin the discussion from very basics. The basics of DNA, what DNA is. So DNA is an acronym for deoxyribonucleic acid, which are a set of instructions found in a cell. And with regards to what they do, these instructions are used for the growth as well as development of an organism. Now DNA itself is a very complicated set of molecules, and there are plethora of information and knowledge to be learned about DNA. But from the perspective of DNA Technology Regulation Bill, the only information relevant over here is that DNA of each person is unique. And so variation in the sequence of DNA or helical structure can be efficiently utilized for identification of the people. So we know that currently we use various other biometrics for identification. One of them is fingerprinting, because obviously we believe that each and every person in this world has a very unique fingerprints. Although there are some similarities, 1 in a million cases, but leaving those exceptions out, each person has a unique fingerprint, and so that is why it is utilized in identification. And similarly, each person in this world has a different set of DNA, or the sequence of bases which form DNA is unique for each and every individual, and that is the basic concept which is utilized in DNA technology. So what are the applications of DNA technology and the uniqueness of DNA sequences for humans? And so just to give you an idea, one of the most important application of DNA technology is in criminal investigation. Because ultimately the task or the goal of all criminal investigations is to arrest the guilty person. And for that, you have to identify that person first. And there are a lot of DNA material which is made available by the accused or the guilty person or the offender if he or she has visited the crime scene. And so through mapping of crime scene, the identity of people who were present at the crime scene can be clearly established. But not just the identification of the criminal, but also it helps in the identification of victims in cases where the dead bodies are either extremely dismembered, or it is very difficult to identify or separate or clearly lay out one body part from another. For example, in 9/11 attack on World Trade Centers, and in case of most disasters, the identity of the dead people is established through DNA technology. And not just criminal investigation or identification of victims, but also DNA technology is now being increasingly utilized for settlement of civil matters as well, especially for establishing the parentage of a person. So these are some of the prominent examples to establish the significance of DNA technology in our society. But the big problem over here is that all these uses are currently unregulated in India. Currently, there is no law or set of rules which shall guide the utilization and application of DNA technology in all these matters. So what it means is that currently there is a legal void or vacuum as to how this technology will be applied, or who will apply it, or who will be the authority to oversee the overall correct and right implementation of this technology and prevent the misuse of this technology. And so various committees, including Law Commission, has recommended the regulation. And so that is why the government has brought DNA Technology Regulation Bill. And so from the perspective of both prelims as well as mains examination, let us go through first the highlights of the bill. So, as we have just discussed, this bill regulates the use of DNA technology for establishing the identity of persons in respect of matters listed in schedule. So, there is a schedule to the bill, which is nothing but a list. So, all those matters which are given in this particular list, or as the bill says, schedule, the DNA technology or DNA profiling can be applied in those cases only. And they of course deal with both criminal as well as civil matters, as we have discussed in the last slide. So that is one of the important highlights of the bill. The second is, as we have understood that since this is mostly an unregulated area, so there is no authority. And so this particular bill establishes two important authorities in this particular field. First is National DNA Data Bank, and the second is DNA Regulatory Board. Now, let me make it clear at the outset that the DNA profiling or the actual work of DNA sequencing shall neither be carried out by National DNA Data Bank nor DNA Regulatory Board. Rather, they shall be conducted by independent labs, just like you have pathological labs. So, there will be separate set of labs for conducting DNA profiling. So there shall be labs which will conduct the DNA profiling, and once the profiling is done, all the data related to the DNA profiling shall be transmitted or transferred to National DNA Data Bank. And each and every data bank shall maintain various kinds of indices. For example, crime scene index, under trial index, offenders index, missing person index, unknown deceased person index. So for example, the crime scene index will catalog all the DNA profiles which were found on a particular crime scene. The unknown deceased index will carry all the DNA profiles of dead bodies which was not claimed by anyone. So police may dispose of the body but preserve the genetic material and DNA profile so that on a later date, the identity of that dead body could be established with the help of the DNA profile which was taken from that dead body. And so there is no need to keep the body in mortuary perpetually. So that is about the DNA profiling and the storage of the data post profiling. But we did not talk about accreditation because there needs to be a certain minimum level of standard maintained at labs. Because ultimately they are testing and profiling a very important aspect of human existence. And so for that purpose, the bill establishes DNA Regulatory Board for accreditation of labs. Each and every lab in India which shall profile the human DNA will have to get an accreditation from DNA Regulatory Board. So after the schedule and establishment of authorities, the third important feature about this particular bill is that it creates a mechanism of written consent for collection of genetic material for DNA profiling purposes. And this is a very important aspect of privacy itself, because you cannot force a person to provide his or her DNA samples. And so it provides for a mandatory consent from a person for collecting his or her DNA sample. If she says no, that means a no. But there are certain exceptions as well which have also been provided in the bill. In those cases, the consent of the person would not matter. And that is if that person is accused of any particular crime for which the punishment is that of more than 7 years. For example, if a person is accused of, let's say, murder or rape. So basically what the bill says is that if the crime is very heinous, you should not be dependent on the consent of the accused. But in all rest of the matters, the consent is mandatory. Now you can easily foresee the kind of data collection which will be enabled through this particular technology. And also we know that once the data will be profiled by the labs, it shall be stored in national DNA data banks and regional DNA data banks. So what will happen to that immense data which is being stored in DNA data banks? So for example, once we have established the identity of a person, or let's say a missing person, what is the future or further utility of that particular DNA profile being stored in DNA data bank? And so the last important feature or important highlight of this particular bill is that it provides for removal of DNA profiles by data banks. So it provides for removal of DNA data on various grounds. So for example, as far as under trials or accused or suspects are concerned, their DNA data can be deleted when police files a completion report saying that these people are no more suspect in a particular case, and so their DNA profile is no more wanted by the police. So that is one of the ways through which the DNA data will be removed. Also, there is a procedure provided in the bill through which a court order can ensure the deletion of a data. So if a person feels that his or her data is being unduly stored, that person can approach court, and so the order will be issued accordingly. Also, there is a third mechanism which is very obvious, that in case of missing persons or unknown and deceased persons, in all these cases, if the members of the family, once the identity is established, they can request, and so that will be done automatically. Not just that, any regulation also requires some punishments and penalties, which is also provided in the bill and shall not be discussed in DNS because of course they are not very important, and if you want you can read in the PDF section. But from the perspective of prelims and mains examination, these are the 4 important features of the bill which you should keep in mind. And so to be able to critically examine any kind of question which has been asked over the bill, you need to be aware about the issues with this particular bill. And the first and foremost issue is the existence of gray area as far as the application of DNA technology is concerned. Because you need to understand that there are other applications as well. For example, there are a lot of diagnostic labs which utilize the DNA technology in order to identify the likelihood of a person falling prey to diseases like cancer or Alzheimer's. Although these labs are not utilizing the DNA technology for identification purposes or for establishment of identity, but rather they are doing it for diagnostic purposes, and so it is not clear whether these labs will come under the supervision or regulation of DNA technology bill or not. So that is issue number 1. And the second important issue is that DNA profiling can reveal extremely sensitive information about an individual. And once you analyze the sequence of DNA, a lot of data can be inferred about a person, for example, pedigree, skin color, behavior, diseases, and also overall health status. So although the data would be collected for purpose of establishment of identity, but the same data can be utilized to infer so many information about that particular individual. Now the problem over here is that the bill does not clearly specifies that only those portions of the sequences would be collected which are sufficient for establishment of the identity. So for example, if this is a person's DNA and if this portion is more than sufficient to establish the identity, why is there a need to store data regarding rest of it? And so it provides for storage of 100% of the DNA profile of an individual. And so of course it will help in establishment of identity, but the analysis of the 100% of the profile will lead to revelation about various other aspects of an individual's identity. And then of course it is going to have a deep impact on the person's or individual's privacy. So that is second important aspect or issue dealing with this bill. Let us now move on to the third one, which will be particularly important in a social context like India, and that is of social stereotyping. We know how social stereotyping work in our society or in any society. So stereotyping is nothing but a generalization about a particular group of people or even a person. So a best case demonstration is that we believe that people belonging to community capital A have this particular trait, and since this person small a belongs to this particular community, he or she must be having that particular trait. So that is a stereotyping which has no basis in rationality whatsoever. And so when these data with respect to behavior, disease and health status, when this data shall be preserved in data banks, and if let's say they illegally become available for analysis, then this kind of stereotyping will be linked with the DNA sequence of that community or that person. And so far there is no scientific basis to such stereotyping, but then there will be attempts to ingrain this stereotyping into scientific foundations, and that will be disastrous for Indian society. Then finally, there are a lot of issues with respect to the storage of the data itself. As we have seen that bill establishes a lot of indices, for example, crime scene index, under trial, missing persons, unknown and offenders. So all these indices have been created in the bill as we have seen. So a lot of commentators have raised a very valid arguments. They say that it is okay to collect the data of the offenders or the people who have already been proven guilty. But what is the purpose to collect and store the data with respect to the crime scene investigation of under trials, missing persons and unknown and deceased person? There is no purpose of storing that data. For example, if crime scene is, let's say, a marriage hall, and we know that must have been visited by at least 100 to 200 people in an Indian scenario. And so if the DNA sample of all these people are going to be stored for a very long time in a DNA data bank, it is ultimately going to hit the privacy of all those who are not involved in the case itself. As far as offenders are concerned, it is much needed because, for example, people who have committed acts like rapes, we need to have their DNA profiles so that we can track them down even if they disappear. But in other cases, it does not make sense. So that is one. The second is that in India we do not still have any data protection law, and we know that this data is going to be stored in a digital format on some or the other kind of server, and this can be stated as one of the most private or data of utmost importance for a particular individual. And so when we have cybersecurity which is often compromised, would it be advisable to store such data on for longer period of time? Then the last very important issue with respect to this bill is that if you focus on the number of schedules, there is no index which is provided for civil matters. There is crime scene index, under trial index, missing persons index, offenders index, unknown deceased person index, but no index for establishment of identity in civil matters. Also, even a more basic question is that why is there a need to even store data in civil matters? Because ultimately you have to establish the parentage, and for that you need genetic material for the people involved in the case, match them, and the result can come instantaneously and there would be no need to store that data. And so with respect to each of these issues, we will have some way forward. So there is a need for a clarification whether these diagnostic centers which are not using the DNA technology for establishment of an identity will come under the purview of this bill or not. Then of course there is a need to cut down on the amount of sequence of a particular person which is needed for establishment of identity. And so the bill should amend in order to state that only selected sequence which are enough to establish the identity should be taken, and there should not be any need for complete profile to be catalogued. And of course, India needs a very robust data protection bill before the passage of DNA technology bill, because ultimately the data of crores of people shall always be threatened. And as we have discussed, there is a need for a creation of an index for civil matters as well. So to just summarize it up for you, we discussed DNA technology bill, what is the need for it, highlights of the bill, issues, and what can be the measures which can improve the current state of the bill. Let us now move on to the next news. Next news item is very important from the perspective of static syllabus of polity. SC asks for timeline on appointments. So the Supreme Court has questioned the government about the delay in clearing collegium recommendations for judicial appointments to various high courts. These recommendations date as back as May or June 2020. And based on this delay, Supreme Court has asked the centre to fix a timeline to clear the recommendations for appointment of judges. And so in this regard, we are going to utilize our mains Compass magazine for Polity and Governance, that was for mains 2020. And we will understand what is collegium system, how collegium system came into existence, what are the 3 judges cases, and what are the problems which have emerged in the functioning of the collegium system. But before that, let us just clear the basics of the Constitution of India with respect to the appointment of the judges of higher judiciary. And these matters are dealt with in Article 124, Clause 2 for Supreme Court and 217, Clause 1 for High Court. And so judges to the Supreme Court and High Court are appointed by the President of India by warrant under his hand and seal respectively under these 2 articles. Judges of Supreme Court shall hold office till the age of 65 years, whereas judges of High Court shall hold office till the age of 62 years. However, the method and manner of their selection to higher judiciary has not been explicitly provided in the Constitution. And hence, the process for appointment, elevation and transfer of judges to higher judiciary has been a debatable issue. We know Government of India earlier passed the Constitution 121st Amendment Bill 2014 to establish a National Judicial Appointment Commission, which was about to replace collegium system. However, a 5-judge bench of Supreme Court declared NJAC as unconstitutional because of interference from executive in the judicial appointments. And so in this manner, let us understand what the process currently is. So what is collegium? So the collegium is one where the Chief Justice of India and a forum of 4 senior most judges of Supreme Court recommend appointment and transfer of judges of higher judiciary. The collegium system evolved through 3 different judgments which are collectively known as the 3 judges cases. So the collegium system does not have either legislative or constitutional backing. Now, recommendations of collegium have been made public on the website of Supreme Court, including the reasons for appointment or transfers. So if collegium system is neither constitutional nor legal, how did it come into existence? So before the collegium system, the earlier practice was that the power to appoint Supreme Court judges rested primarily with the executive. The practice was to appoint the senior most judge of the Supreme Court whenever a vacancy occurred by the executive. That is fair enough. But the troubles began when there was a departure from this process. Because in 1973, the Union government departed from this practice and appointed Justice A.N. Ray as Chief Justice of India, who was 4th in the order of seniority and hence bypassing 3 senior judges of the Supreme Court. The government was accused of tampering with the independence of judiciary. We know that these 3 senior judges resigned from their posts in protest. Again in 1976, government appointed Justice Beg as Chief Justice of India, bypassing Justice Khanna, who was senior to him. Thus, interference by executive in judicial appointments was cloaked in wheels of politics, and it started a disturbing trend in judicial appointments in India. We know till 1976, India had witnessed emergency and implementation of 42nd Amendment, which had casted a serious doubt on the ever-growing power of executive in all spheres of democracy. And so in such an environment of growing executive influence, the collegium system evolved through 3 different judgments which are collectively known as the 3 judges cases, and let us understand them and their significance. So these are a series of 3 judgments which were delivered by Supreme Court, and the first one of them known as first judge's case, which was SP Gupta versus Union of India in 1982, where the Supreme Court held the decision in favor of the executive, where the Supreme Court held that the opinion of Chief Justice of India and Chief Justice of High Court was merely consultative, and the power of appointment resides solely and exclusively with the central government. The central government could override the opinion given by the judges. So the first judge's case clearly uplifted the position of executive as far as appointment of judges of higher judiciary is concerned. Then of course this particular judgment was challenged in 1993, which is known as second judge's case, and here the Supreme Court clearly emphasized that the government does not enjoy primacy or absolute discretion in matters of appointment of Supreme Court judges. Court said that provision for consultation with Chief Justice was introduced as Chief Justice of India is best equipped to know and assess the worth and suitability of a candidate. And according to Supreme Court, it was also necessary to eliminate political interference. And hence Supreme Court held that selection should be made as a result of participatory consultative process, where executive has the power to act as a mere check on the exercise of power by Chief Justice of India to achieve constitutional purpose and not otherwise. And finally, the third judge's cases, which led to the emergence of collegium system, which is known today. So Supreme Court, on a reference made by the President under Article 143, laid down the following proposition with respect to the appointment of Supreme Court judges. While making recommendation, Chief Justice of India shall consult 4 senior most judges of Supreme Court. So it is just not the prerogative of Chief Justice of India. This is more democratized than that. Then the opinion of all members of collegium regarding their recommendation shall be in writing. Then the view of the senior most Supreme Court judge who hails from the High Court from where the person recommended comes must be obtained in writing for collegium's consideration. Then if majority of collegium is against the appointment of a particular person, that person shall not be appointed. Then even if 2 of the judges have reservation against appointment of a particular judge, Chief Justice of India would not press for such appointment. Then A High Court judge of outstanding merit can be appointed as Supreme Court judge regardless of his standing in the seniority list. So these are the current rules which guide the functioning of the collegiate system. But again, this particular collegiate system is also not beyond the criticisms, and the four major criticisms leveled against the collegiate system is lack of transparency, nepotism, politicization of judiciary, and absence of permanent commission. Lack of transparency because collegium system worked in complete secrecy and initially did not reveal the methodology or the reasons or the procedure followed for transfer or promotion of judges or even appointment of senior lawyers as judges of Supreme Court and High Court. Then, of course, charges of nepotism because there have been a lot of instances of favoritism and preferential treatment to members from judicial fraternity. This also impacted the quality of judgment, especially in high courts as well. Then, due to lack of transparency in appointment process, certain political appointments, especially to high courts, have been witnessed in past 2 decades. Then, of course, there is an absence of permanent commission, which has been recommended by Law Commission and also by the National Commission to review the working of Constitution in 2002. We know that Constitution was amended to include National Judicial Commission, but it was declared null and void by the Supreme Court. This next news, Conservationist joins panel on Elephant Corridor case, appears on page number 8. So the Supreme Court on Wednesday appointed Conservationist Nandita Hazarika as member of a technical committee constituted by it on October 14th last year to hear complaints by landowners against the action taken by the Nilgiris collector, which included sealing of their buildings and allegations about the arbitrary variance in acreage of the elephant corridor. As we all know that elephant is one of the most important species as far as India's conservation efforts are concerned, and so we are going to discuss few very prelims specific information with respect to this important species. In the list of protected species, which basically means that it is inside Schedule 1 of India's Wildlife Protection Act 1972, and it also finds its place in CITES or Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Flora and Fauna. There is a Project Elephant which is run since 1992, which is a central government sponsored scheme through which the government helps in the protection and management of elephants in the states which have wild elephants in a free-ranging population. It ensures the protection of elephant corridors and elephant habitat for the survival of the elephant population in the wild. Under this scheme, the Union government provides technical and financial help to these states to carry out and achieve the goals of Project Elephant. Not just that, assistance for the purpose of the census, training of field officials is also provided to ensure the mitigation and prevention of man-elephant conflict. Apart from that, central agencies along with state officials coordinate to prevent illegal trade of ivory and ensure elephant protection from hunters and poachers. An important aspect of elephant is that the Government of India in 2010 declared elephant as the national heritage animal of the country on the recommendation of Standing Committee of National Board for Wildlife. This was done to make sure that sufficient protection to elephant was provided before their numbers fall to panic levels like in the case of tigers. As far as elephant reserves are concerned, there are around 32 elephant reserves in India. The very first elephant reserve or elephant sanctuary was the Singhbhum Elephant Reserve of Jharkhand. Then there is something which is known as monitoring of illegal killing of elephants or the MIKE program, the aim of which is to provide information required by the elephant range countries. So basically those countries where the natural wild population of elephants exist, as far as proper management and long-term protection of their elephant population is concerned. And two main objectives of MIKE program is to measure the level and trend in the illegal poaching and ensure changes in the trends for elephant protection, and to determine the factors responsible for such changes and to assess the impact of decisions by conference of parties to CITES. So this last article revised the text of the budget speech appears on page number 6. And in this particular article, the author talks about a lot of mechanisms which the government adopts, which actually hides the real condition of the overall economy and the state of finances of the government of India. But we are not going to discuss this article. We are not going to discuss this article because today is 28th of January, and in the next week, Baswa sir is going to come up with his own series on economic survey and budget. And I think no one could be better than Baswa sir to explain these things, and that is next week.